Take warning, O ye ladies fair, that wear gowd on your hair. Come never into Chartres Wood, for Tamlin, he is there. That's the opening line of one of the many, many versions of Tamlin, a very famous Scottish ballad. It's a very old ballad, it probably dates to at least the 1500s, if not earlier, but it has been retold hundreds and hundreds of times over the centuries and continues to be a very important part of Scottish folk tradition even today. In the story, a woman, after being warned that she should not go into the forest, nonetheless goes into the forest and there finds a young man, Tamlin. He's very handsome. She plucks a rose, which is a good euphemism for having sex, and then she becomes pregnant. She goes home, she comes back later, and this time pregnant, knowing she's pregnant, and looks for herbs to help her have an abortion. And Tamlin yet again appears and says, "No, do not scathe my babe away," and tries to convince her that she should keep it, she could keep his child. And she decides that if she's going to keep this child, she wants him to marry her. And to do that, she has to rescue him from the fairy queen who's keeping him trapped in this forest where he cannot escape. And so she goes and she tricks the fairy queen into releasing him, and she grabs him and she has to hold on tight, and that's quite important. And she holds on tight until morning, until she can grab him and bring him back into the real world where they can have their happily ever after. And there are actually lots of different versions of the story that emphasise different features of that story. But one of the really important parts of the tale is this kind of moment in the forest, this dangerous space, this space of potential. Lots and lots of Scottish fairy tales happen in what are known as liminal spaces, spaces that exist kind of outside of normal human habitation, outside of towns and cities, and instead happen in forests or in riverbanks, moments where places where you wouldn't necessarily build a house, where you wouldn't expect to find other people, where you should in theory at least be alone, and then when you do encounter people there, you have a higher odds than usual that they're going to be magical creatures who either will do something terrible to you, or in this case, be handsome men that you can fall in love with. And it's a really interesting question about these lonely spaces in fairy tales, about what they're there for, and why they're so interesting, and what they do, and why they feature so strongly in the popular imagination. I have been doing a lot of work on Scottish early modern communities recently, and their idea of community. And in that, I've been emphasising the central value of neighbourly love, that you should love one another as a Christian value, and the way that was played out in everyday ethics, the way that we should treat people, we should show hospitality and kindness and charity, but it also means that we should not swear at them and get in fights with them, and we should be honest in our dealings, and generally we should, be good and upstanding people when we work together with our neighbours. And one of the benefits of this idea of love for these communities was it was designed to develop a sort of community relation that was very close-knit and embedded. So people had a lot of investment in each other's lives and understood and knew each other very well. And so in some ways, I think we might think of those communities, we call them, tight-knit. And to the modern world, we might think a bit too tight-knit, lots of nosy neighbours peering in your windows, knowing who you're up to, what you're up to. Gossiping and telling on you to the church when you committed sins. So this is a kind of very overbearing kind of community, but it's one that was understood to be comfortable. And this is a word that is used a lot in early modern Scottish material and in the church. Comfort for these people was not just a cosy blanket or a sofa in front of a fire. Comfort to them was actually being surrounded by those people and feeling like they were that supportive community. So when you knew that something went wrong, you ran out of food, or your child became ill, or you needed some help of some sort, there was a community there to support and protect you and help you. And that gave you a sense of comfort in the world. And so comfort for these people is much less the material goods that comes to be understood as later in history, and more the sort of social and emotional support that you can have. And so when things go wrong in those communities, as they sometimes do, people talk about being discomforted or being made uncomfortable. So when people commit crimes, for example, they often write in their petitions to leave, to be banished. They will say, "Don't try me for the crime where I might get executed. Please just banish me because I can no longer live in comfort in this community. Even if this isn't true, even if I'm found innocent, the damage to my reputation is such I can no longer be comfortable." And so they're using that word. And so we can think of this interesting idea of discomfort as being the opposite of comfort, but also I think it's associated with loneliness. And early modern communities take loneliness quite seriously, even though they don't have a word for it. Loneliness is starting to appear in this period, in the 18th century at least, but they usually use the word alone, sometimes lonely, but very rarely loneliness as a modern word as we understand it. But they do instead, I think, use this language of comfort and discomfort in a similar way to suggest the emotional connections and then disconnections of being together or being separated from each other. And one of the big ways that this community disciplines people is to banish them. And banishment happens at all sorts of levels. So it can happen if you get done for a serious crime. An alternative to execution is often banishment or banishment beyond the seas. It happens for small and local crimes. If you go to the local court, you can get banished from the town. And sometimes you're only banished for weeks or months or years. It's not a permanent thing. It's just, you have to stay outside of the town for a period of time. But sometimes banishment can be more permanent, more long lasting. And what happens in banishment is that people are pushed into the margins. So if we imagine that villages and towns have boundaries, which are very much marked in those days, people often walk the boundaries ritually every year, so people know where those boundaries are. They're expected, if you're banished, to stay outside of those boundaries. And that means that the spaces between towns and villages are these kind of liminal sites where people walk, to and from, sites where they do agriculture and farming and those kind of things, but also sites that are, in some senses, not part of community. You have been banished to them. And Scottish communities, like other parts of Europe, have people who live in those marginal spaces who are tramps and beggars and other sorts of poor people who have, for whatever reason, have been excluded from society. And we don't know as much about them as we'd like to, but where we see them in the criminal records, we know they often have quite poor lives and they get by on begging and stealing and kind of living in those marginal sites. But they also build their own communities, as you would imagine. People on the road bond together, they find them. But what I'd like to kind of suggest is that because they are pushed into these marginal spaces, these spaces that in Scottish fairy tales are kind of imagined in terms of places that are sort of liminal and not of community, that these people live sort of lonely existences, isolated from community, discomforted as a sort of set of existence. And so that loneliness for these people is kind of what happens in these forests, in these woods, on these riverbanks, when they live their lives outside of community norms of love, of loving behaviour. But rather than being all negative, and I do think there is a lot of negative there, don't get me wrong, there's also some really interesting things that fairy tales tell us, and that is, in your forest you might meet a handsome man, or you might go to a riverbed and meet a witch or a hag, perhaps in Scottish stories, who might offer you something magical that opens up the world for you. And so I think we can also think of these liminal spaces, these liminal sites, as places where people have opportunity to be creative, to make new ways of being and doing. And we also see that with our people who are banished, because they are often banished for short periods of time. And this moment in these liminal spaces is meant to be an opportunity for rebirth and regrowth, and ideally to find God, and to find God in those spaces, and then to re-evaluate your life and then move back into community in a more orderly and well-behaved manner, to become back into being loving again. But I think it's quite useful then to think of these moments of isolation and these moments of creativity as moments of creativity, as moments where we can do sort of interesting and exciting things and rethink who we are, rethink our world, rethink what's going forward in the future. Perhaps now, reflecting on our present, where we're all isolated because of COVID, we might also, looking at the economic repercussions for that, of the major changes when we shut down the world, that are now we're going to have long-lasting repercussions for that. We could also see these moments as this shutdown, this moment of isolation, as one that has given us opportunity to stop and think about what we want to be, who we want to be as a world, who we want to be as a planet, and perhaps work towards a new future, and a future that's more sustainable, more inclusive, more interesting. So perhaps instead of always thinking of isolation as something negative, we can also see it as something that gives us opportunity to rebuild and to find our handsome man that we will take home with us at the end of our happy tale. Thank you.